My name is Bob Osborne, and I'm the Chief Technology Officer for Global Governments at ServiceNow. Previously, I was a federal CIO at the National Nuclear Security Administration and Deputy CIO at the U.S. Transportation Command. I also served on the Army G4 as an Army civilian, helping the programmatics of all the Army logistics systems after a 27-year career in the United States Marine Corps. So it's a real pleasure for me to be hosting and acting as your moderator on today's program, Managing Risk, Resilience, and Security Across Your Agency, hosted by ServiceNow. You know, managing risk and compliance with a manual, siloed, reactive work model is no longer effective as the global regulatory environment continues to evolve, forcing changes across the government. Changes are driven by the need to adopt new business models, establish new partner relationships, deploy new technologies, and address the increasing number of threats and cyber risks. Many agencies have discovered that without an integrated view of what their risk profile looks like, it's virtually impossible to quickly assess the impact on their existing compliance obligations and risk posture that accompany these changes. Today, we're going to discuss all of this and more with our panel of expert speakers, and I couldn't be more thrilled with the group that we have with us today. Joining us will be Pete Goulman, the Enterprise Risk Officer for Cyber within the Department of State. We've got Bill Marion, who's a Managing Director at Accenture Federal Services and the former CIO of the U.S. Air Force. And last but certainly not least, we've got Kush Budoshi, Managing Director for Cyber Strategy and Risk at Accenture Federal Services. Now, throughout today's program, we'll be taking questions from you in the audience. Make sure to submit yours via the Q&A tab on the right side of your screen. I'd love for you to participate and take advantage of this time to ask the questions that you have around this very timely topic to our panelists. So I'd like if we could get started here by having each of our panelists identify themselves, give a quick introduction and what your role is within your organization. So Bill, why don't we start with you? Can you start us off with an introduction, please?
Yeah, happy to. Thanks for the invite, first of all. A very, very important topic these days. Again, as mentioned, Bill Marion, former CIO of the Air Force, but now Managing Director for Growth and Strategy across the Defense and Intelligence portfolio. So I'd argue it's kind of the same role I had, but with on the different side of the fence, if you will. So looking at it from an industry lens, which is really informative. About 28 years with the Air Force, everything from starting my days in the intelligence world and the IT business, up through the early days of cyber operations and how we operationalize that activity across the DoD, and then most recently in the last few years, more with an IT, CTO, CIO lens at two major commands and the Air Force. So definitely on this topic, have seen it through the lens of both an intel perspective, a cyber perspective, and a traditional CIO, CTO perspective. But again, thanks for the invite.
Well, thanks for joining us, Bill, and that's certainly impressive credentials. And like you, having been in the federal government and now looking at it from the business side of the equation, it's really remarkable as we look across the agencies and see the challenges that folks are dealing with in risk compliance, being able to now, we talk about continuous authorization programs that are in effect, and the similarities you really see across departments, whether they're within the civilian agencies or the defense agencies, is really quite striking, in my opinion. Kushbu, would you mind introducing yourself and a little bit about what you're doing with Accenture Federal, please?
Absolutely. Thank you so much again for having us this afternoon. My name is Kush Budoshi. So within Accenture Federal Services and the cyber practice more specifically, I'm the strategy and risk lead across all our federal agencies. So I've personally had the pleasure of implementing regulatory requirements for a lot of the organizations, whether it's the armed services, whether it's the federal civilian agencies. So I will definitely say I bring a different perspective to this group because I've had to live and breathe it all from the risk management framework perspective to FISCAM to other regulatory requirements. So again, thank you so much for having me and look forward to our discussion.
Well, Kushbu, thank you very much, and we appreciate your ability to go deep on any of the questions that we get from our audience, because it really is state-of-the-art implementation of a risk framework and a compliance realization that allows our agencies to be in the best possible posture to defend the information that they have within their agencies. Now, I understand that Peter's having a little bit of technical difficulty in joining us, but we're not going to let that stop us here today. We're going to go on and begin some of the topics that we have to discuss. And as soon as Peter can join us, I'll ask him to introduce himself and he'll join into the discussion. So, Kushbu, if you don't mind starting, when we talk about government agencies' operational level capabilities, something you're very familiar with, we find they're very complex with lots of components and missions, a lot of different vectors that you have to consider as you're talking about your risk profile. What are some of the biggest challenges to taking an enterprise approach to risk and compliance within this type of very complex environment? What do you see across the government today?
I think that's a wonderful question. One of the things, especially as we've been working with lots of different agencies, is that depending on how they're structured, they're working in a lot of silos. So sometimes from a enterprise approach, if you are trying to implement something, if the agency is broken down into a sub-agency or a sub-command level, the equation doesn't always translate, or that the sub-agency is doing something different than at the enterprise level. So that's what we see. Also, going back to, I think I was briefly talked when I introduced myself, I talked about RMF and FISCAM. So what we've noticed is if you have to implement not only your cybersecurity requirements, or you have to implement your audit requirements, we don't see those work streams necessarily always working together. So what ends up happening is you're duplicating efforts. They're stovepiped. The processes are stovepiped. So at that point in time, when you think through it, you really want an overall enterprise-wide risk management approach where not only are you thinking from how do I deploy it from the overall top level, but how is it going to work at the bottom level where each of the system owners are the ones who have to implement these requirements?
I couldn't agree more. And, when I was at the NNSA in particular, the ability to get a clear view across the enterprise computing environment on what's really happening can be really challenging. And now as agencies are pushing out into cloud service providers through commercial entities as vendor partnerships are evolving. And Bill, I know that you were a big proponent of cloud and software as a service vendors with your time in the Air Force. Can you give us your perspective on that, kind of what you dealt with that complexity and some of the things you're seeing now from your viewpoint at Accenture?
Well, I think at the macro level, kind of tying to what Kushbu was talking about, is we did create a bunch of silos because the scale is so large, right? So to some degree, we had to kind of, as humans, decompose the problem out. But the problem is we never brought it back together. And so I think a couple things when you're managing a complex environment, you probably saw this as well, is as the CIO or senior leadership, how are you setting the risk tone from the get-go, right? What are you willing to accept? How are you unifying that thread, knowing that you've got to decentrally execute a pretty complex environment? And so I think that leadership tone is one of the things that everyone should really focus on. If you're not on the leadership side, how do you, on the lower levels, help your leadership unify that messaging? Because if you're not unifying the messaging, the technology won't get you there either, right? And so I think we always talk on the technology front, which is critically important, but I would marry what Kushbu was saying with the strategic messaging to it. And then ultimately, decomposing that and mechanizing it through that technology base. And so from a leadership down to a technical, that mechanization in a complex ecosystem is what I would argue every CIO, CISO has to go through. The problem is the tools haven't been mature enough in many cases up until these days. And so now people are just starting to go through, how do we actually orchestrate a pretty complex beast, right? Much less get to the actual continuous monitoring and the more complex aspects of it. We got to get the basic blocking and tackling right. But I just think it starts first and foremost with messaging at the leadership level, and then how are you working those silos and bringing those together, and then executing the tech base underneath.
I think that that's really an important point, Bill. It's people, process, and technology when you talk about your risk profile. And I certainly did see that myself in my experience. But, One of the things that I think perhaps our audience would be interested in is some specifics of, besides just messaging and how you view knitting together the pieces of the different puzzle of the silos that you described. What are some other ways perhaps that you could share the insights of how we break through those barriers that are kind of created organically, particularly in larger organizations, like you said?
Well, the one aspect, I mean, just like in software development, we've gone from this waterfall approach to agile, as an example, right? I would argue security shouldn't be any different than that. Part of agile is what do you bring up front, what strategy and mechanizing do you do up front, and then how do you build out in iterative steps that create the agility that where you can adjust where you got it right and you can adjust where you got it wrong. And so I think there's still too much of a cultural norm around, I'll call it cyber, waterfall, if you will. Maybe I coined a term just now, but it is a very cyber waterfall in many cases. And so I think that agility kind of concept of safe or scrum or agile, whatever term you want to use, so that you're actioning the core steps. And so this is where the technology comes in and where we did like fast track ATO of mechanizing DevSecOps with your platform, with your security platform. And when you start to link those steps together, then you can truly orchestrate this thing with the agility that you need, because frankly, you're not going to get it right. You're not going to get it right 100% of the time. It's just part of security. So what's important is those iterative steps. What's important is the tie to the tech. And it's important that you can adjust fire and you can really burn down those risks as you identify them.
Great points, Bill. Kushbu, one thing that Bill mentioned a couple of times there is agility. And I think agility is really key in our response mechanisms to any event within the computing environment, but certainly if it's a cyber incursion. And the complementary approach or term that I think of when I hear someone say agility is resilience. So resilience is really kind of an outgrowth of being agile and being able to respond to an event within the computing environment. Where do you see this type of a resiliency residing? And perhaps are there some individual efforts that can be taken by agencies to create resiliency by utilizing some of the things that Bill had mentioned?
Yep, absolutely. I mean, when it goes back to the resiliency, and Bill talked about using the agile methodology for even the cyber components. It's important to think through, resiliency, I mean, when we think about quote unquote the word compliance, people are thinking, I just have to do all the process documentation, get through my ATO, and we'll be good. But that's not it. Right? The idea is, how are we really taking a proactive risk-based approach? So are we implementing the security requirements? It's not a documentation exercise. What are we looking at from a detailed perspective? And that's where the resiliency comes in. So when I'm doing a designing of a system or when I'm developing a system, have I taken those key components, or not just from a technical aspect, but an overall process aspect? How am I going to manage that, right? And if I think about it from the get-go, and if I'm, as part of the overall DevSecOps process, if I'm shifting my security requirements to the left, then I'm being resilient, right? So when we start thinking about different threat vectors or attack mechanisms that are happening, why should it always be that we're figuring about it or we're thinking about it after the fact? Or, we have all these vulnerabilities that come out. We have Patch Tuesday. We have so many different things. But if we build it in from the get-go, right, that's where it makes a difference. That's where we can be more resilient. We are planning for it, and not as opposed to reacting to it.
I couldn't agree more. And, we often talk about, having security baked into our solutions, but it's really so much more than that, because you have to have all the ingredients of whatever that security posture is that you're baking. I think you described it really well. Thank you for that. I'm really happy that Pete Goldman is actually now able to join us. So Pete, welcome. Again, Pete is the Enterprise Risk Officer for Cyber at the Department of State. And Pete, we've just been discussing some of the challenges of complex agencies have with their different multitude of components and missions, and some of the biggest challenges. And we've heard Bill describe, creating silos of excellence, if you will, in large, complex enterprises or agencies. The Department of State is very similar to the Department of Defense in having a global mission and very complex computing environment. What are some of your perspectives on how you deal with the challenges of taking an enterprise approach in such a complex environment as the Department of State?
Thank you for that question, and thanks for the invite to join. And I'm going to give you two answers. First, anecdotally, I think I just experienced it. A large, complex technical environment. I was trying to join for the past 45 minutes from my agency network that allegedly allows me to do so, but for some reason, WebEx events is a little different at WebEx meeting. So I've joined on my personal laptop, which stresses the point I was listening to about resilience. Getting right to your point, however, you're absolutely correct. Any large global enterprise operates with multiple networks and a plethora of technology activity to engage both internally and externally with official staff, non-official staff, and population at large. And the struggle that we go through in managing that is the dichotomy of how can you be fully open to people to do business, yet also prevent those people that intend to do you harm from finding opportunities to do so. And that's a delicate balance, and I think we all face that, especially my business colleagues that are in a for-profit or a sales-like enterprise where they also have to engage anybody that wishes to do business with them. We rely upon a couple different things, and I apologize if I'm going to be repetitive of something Bill might have said from the DoD perspective, but it's a mixture of threat awareness and a constant vigilance, which is by which I mean detection and monitoring. To your operating environments are reasonably well protected to the extent that you can. And then where you have gaps or an inability to protect effectively, relying upon your detection capabilities to highlight areas where you need to place attention, whether that's resolving any types of weaknesses that have cropped up or detecting things that we typically call anomalous activity, things that are typically unexplained that may require further attention. And I make that sound oversimplified, but in fact, it's a little deeper than that because we all know that lingering out there is shadow IT. That in any large enterprise, there are pockets of things where people innovate, specifically for the purposes of mission or business effectiveness, that don't always play nice, for lack of better words, with the enterprise programs to help provide safeguards.
That's a really great perspective, Pete, and thank you for that. And thank you for powering through and showing your personal resilience in joining us here today, because the program would be much less viable without you. So thanks a lot for sticking with us on that. But I'd like to stick with you and pose this question as we go forward, because Bill and I have kind of been sharing our past experiences as practitioners in the government, and Kushbu's been sharing her experiences as a practitioner from the Accenture side. But as a current government official responsible for so much of this cyber risk profile management, can you share with us what your philosophy is on risk assessment, management, and reduction?
Sure, and I'll preface that with basically, even though I'm here on behalf of the State Department, most of my comments, if not all of them, are my own opinions. So I want to just put that forward, that I'm speaking on behalf of myself, not necessarily the views of my agency. But my perspective is that much of attention, in fact, if I had to put percentages on it, I'd probably lean in the neighborhood of 90+% of all cyber focus is focused on technology and on systems. And we've been at this for many years. FISMA was originally crafted in 2002. It was preceded by a sunsetted law that felt like FISMA a little bit before that. So it's been a long time that we've been working on this. And we've tried impact side approaches to where we protect based upon how important things are, realizing that, that's very, very difficult. That's like trying to stop everything when only one thing needs to be in place to create a problem. To threat-sided focus, to where we try and understand the threat actors that we're dealing with effectively and the approaches they may take, so we can target our actions to be able to thwart their success. And in reality, all of it is beneficial, but none of it is a panacea. We don't have that perfect solution set. And so when I look at risk management, and I look at that from the perspective of how am I supposed to help the agency understand what it faces, yet still go out and do business and leverage technology for the benefit of extending diplomacy across and democracy across the globe, we have to look at that balance, and that's where the risk management comes in. And for me, it's very mission side focused. It's an interesting dynamic that because this is mostly in the technology lane, most of the technologists are the ones trying to characterize the business relevance rather than talking to mission partners. And that's a difficult thing. And I don't want to belittle the actions of my colleagues because they're putting a good college try into it. But often our business partners don't have a depth of understanding of the technology to interrelate to what we're trying to achieve. And so there's a lot of effort in, you've heard this the past few years, technologists learning to speak to boards learning to speak a little bit about cyber. The idea here is bridging that gap. And I think the most important aspect for me on the risk management philosophy is engaging your business or your mission partners in the language that they understand. They manage risk all day, every day. They just don't fully understand cyber. And it's incumbent upon us to help them understand that so they can take that into consideration of what they are attempting to do. With the ultimate goal of, it's best if they know what's a good thing to do and what's not to do, rather than being advised or told what they should or shouldn't do by the technologist. And that's fundamentally my philosophy. Reduction, real quickly, ties to a very difficult challenge that there isn't really a guideline anywhere that says if you do the following 15 things, you should be reasonably secure. We don't have that level of due care defined. So it really comes down to, and I say this jokingly, but it's like the Dirty Harry movie when he's staring at the perpetrator with his gun and says, "How lucky do you feel?" And it feels like that some days, trying to make a decision on how lucky you feel. But that's fundamentally engaging the business opinions and business views into how technology is operated, helping them understand when they're getting out their way so that they know how exposed they are. And then, supporting them to the best we can in assuring the environment effectively for their use.
I couldn't agree more, and I love the analogy because as we see agencies who are focusing on defending their agency information, the defense is always the tougher job to have, right? Because they have to be right all the time, and the offense only has to be right once. So that ability to have a philosophy that encompasses a holistic enterprise approach, I think, is really key. And I could agree more, Pete. Bill, what do you think when you think back on your time in the Air Force and what you've seen now, as you have a broader view across multiple agencies? Is there a particular philosophy that you apply when you're talking with clients?
No, absolutely, and I would jump on what Pete was saying there. It's not just even the accuracy, it's the perfection, right? So cyber is a very imperfect science, right? Because there's so many different opportunities for the adversaries to get in. And so really the burning platforms that I've tried, and again, very, very aligned with what Pete's saying here, is first off, speed matters in this business. And fundamentally, the reason why the RMF and the compliance process are not the right answer from one aspect is they don't drive speed. When you think about speed, you think about, am I on the current platform? Am I in the latest patch? Am I on the, you always have to up your game, and that speed and your ability to respond very quickly is of the utmost. So oftentimes, I would give a story of like a big modernization program that was going to take us 18 months to accredit, which was the very system that was going to make us more secure. And when people started to put that in their vernacular, it was like, well, speed matters. Like, yes. And so that's the first equation is we should be asking ourselves every time we go through an RMF step, does this make me stronger, better, faster in this race against a constantly changing adversary? The second side of that, and again, kind of a variant off of what Pete was saying, is on the mission side is people will get their mission done. So if we're not adjusting constantly to our user base and how they need to operate to maximize, right? It's just like Pete's scenario here of having to get on his personal desktop. If we do DDoS attacks on our own ecosystem because we've made it so hard to operate, I would also argue we put ourselves at more risk as well. And so the speed and agility and responsiveness to interface with the customers, the PEOs, the acquisition arms, to not be the person, again, that's sitting there on the backside, but is proactively every day orchestrating, and us orchestrating our policies and our technologies in concert, as an example, with our DevSecOps app pipeline, which is really how we did the fast track ATO work. We partnered with the AQ community to say, how do we bring these two pieces together? And that's what brought the speed and agility in that new policy. And so I couldn't agree with Pete more. I just kind of really hone in on those two core things as CISOs and senior cyber people. Are you addressing speed, right? Are you up in your game constantly? And are you kind of thinking like the adversary and helping your mission partners truly succeed in what they do?
You know, Bill, I love that. And to coin the Air Force vernacular, speed is life, right? And I really like how you've taken that speed aspect and applied it within the realm of cyber, because machine speed is really what we're talking about when we talk about dealing with incursions within our computing environments. You know, Kushbu, a philosophical approach to looking across the enterprise and having a philosophy in place on how you advise clients on how they keep their cybersecurity risk profile as robust as possible is something I think that's really important. What do you see as you look across the agencies today?
No, thank you for the question. So one of the things, I mean, not just agencies, but as NIST also came out with, I mean, everyone needs to move to more of an ongoing authorization or a continuous authorization model. So what we've done previously, I mean, and anyone who's done RMF or ATO processes, they know everyone's like, okay, let's go through our ATO process. I don't have to worry about it. We'll worry about it 3 years from now. But that's not the way to be, right? I mean, with the continuous authorization requirements that are coming in today, or not just today, but just us proactively thinking through what we need to implement, that's the philosophy I think we really need to move towards. It is not a documentation exercise. We should still be able to implement our systems, our technologies without having to just worry about a paper process. As Bill mentioned, as Pete mentioned, it's a risk-based approach that we need to take. And so what we need to move away from is, hey, let me go ahead and submit all my paperwork, go through all that documentation and say, all right, as Bill mentioned, we had the fast track ATO process. How have we implemented our controls in our environment? And are they truly what we need to get those quote unquote authorization or accreditation approvals? So I think my philosophy more specifically on this topic is we need to change that mindset. That mindset is not going to change over time. It will change over time, but it won't change immediately. So we have to take steps towards it. So whether it's a phased approach, a strategic roadmap, whatever you want to call it, right? But we need to move towards that mindset, saying, let's implement our requirements, but let's not just think of it as, okay, I've documented it. Is it done? Is the paperwork done? And then move from that perspective.
Thanks. And you scared me for a minute, Kushbu, because when you said that mindset won't change over time, I thought you were talking about me. I thought maybe But anyway, Pete, one thing that we really recognize within the realm of cybersecurity in general is, the malicious actors are always changing. They're always moving. The target is shifting. And the ability to put mere compliance steps, to have controls that are static is kind of archaic. Some of it's very necessary as we prepare the battlefield to defend our information. But there has to be much more to what Bill said earlier and Kushbu said earlier, agility in the equation, but almost a fluidity. I think that's really the ground swell that created the continuous authorization concept and programs that we're hearing about right now. What do you think about that? Is that a viable way to think of things? And how can we get ahead of what the adversary is doing by constantly changing the battlefield on us?
So those are great questions. And Bob, you used a couple terms that I'm going to key off of. You mentioned battlefield, you mentioned adversary, you mentioned threat. And these are all terms that typically we would use to describe a war. And I think that, again, my opinion is that as active as the threat environment is in cyberspace and what we've been dealing with, it's difficult not to say that these adversaries are up to ill intent on a level that would be commensurate with what we previously knew in years before as those sort of battlefield engagements. I don't, and I want to be explicit here, I am not relating what's going on right now with the terminology of calling it a cyber war. That's not my call. That's above my level. But the reality of it is that the reason I use that example is because any battlefield commander will tell you what they need is command and control. And what that means is that they have a view of what's happening. They have a single comprehensive pane of glass look at the environment they're managing. And then this goes in the direction of what you were describing with the continuous monitoring. It's the world of static activities have to be supplanted with agility. It's not that we don't have to do the blocking and tackling that's necessary to set up the foundation of assurance. We do have to do these things. But once we've done that, we also have to have the ability to be agile to evaluate any given change. Now, you would think with the emphasis upon that now that's something new to the landscape, but in reality, it's been in, as far as the government is concerned, it's been in the NIST guidelines for many years now, well over a decade, that it called for continuous monitoring. It's been difficult to implement. It's been difficult to get that view of everything. The continuous diagnostics and mitigation program that the Department of Homeland Security's Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency have been working on grew out of a number of different concepts, one of which was a prototype that was operated in the State Department called iPost. And the beauty of this is that through using the same means we have for evaluating the what we typically call network housekeeping tasks, keeping an eye on the operation of a viable network, we were able to draw indicators out of that we can use to evaluate how protected we are. We can do this on a global basis fairly rapidly in the hundreds of, well, let's say over 100,000 endpoint devices. And this type of visualization and the ability to correlate, and this is the real key piece here, correlating that what you have with the indicators you get back from your technology environment, correlating that to what you know about geopolitical or geographically based threat activities, and then align that to your mission requirements. And by this, I mean, don't just go ask now how important is this to the mission, but actually having the mission relevance of the technology that you're operating understood, so you can very quickly assess the degree of how much impact or how much concern you should have based upon what you're evaluating to determine action, right? The idea here is let the technology manage the technology because it runs at great speed, and let's save the human cycles for the things that require the high order analysis. And to get there, we have to have this single pane of glass or this situational awareness.
I think that's a great point, Pete, because, you know, when I was in the business with the government, visibility and control were always the key. Understanding what was really happening across the computing environment, then being able to respond to that and mitigate whatever the issue was at as close to machine speed as possible was really important. And of course, the tools that are available to you and other agency practitioners today are much greater and more effective than the things that I was dealing with. You know, Bill, as you look at this idea of being able to get one step ahead of the adversary, if you will, and try to bring into the equation more automation and more artificial intelligence, for example, what do you see from your vantage point as being something that our audience can take to their bank and put into effect in their agencies?
Yeah, I'll kind of close out with some of what Pete was also addressing too into that, hopefully tie it back together. But, you know, we graded ourselves by RMF packages, 5 years ago. Then we started grading ourselves by the tools that we put out, trying to get to continuous monitoring, but it wasn't quite there. And then I would say recently, and this is where I'd give a lot of credit to Dana Deasy when he was in the seat, was starting to move to the indicators, right? So as we go through, if you can really focus on what are those real kind of things, two-factor authentication or the latest patch in OS levels, or how much we've migrated services to a FedRAMP authorized cloud provider. I think we've started making those fundamental shifts on how we mechanize, from the old days of now, don't get me wrong, there's still a lot of antibodies out there. There's still a lot of people tracking, because it's a lot easier to track compliance than it is to go through those indicators and warnings and those kind of things. But I think that maturation people should recognize and continue to draw out, because if you're a CISO of an organization and you're not looking at the key indicators and threat vectors, right, tying threat to your tool sets, I think you're failing in this business, because frankly, you could be securing a lot of stuff and it just doesn't matter. So I would give you that lens. The other lens that I think that has really started to change the tune, and you're probably familiar with the hack the DoD or hack the Pentagon, hack the Air Force, hack the Army, is also stepping away from your, what's straight in front of your face and starting to mechanize that aspect as well. Getting a true third-party view into your ecosystem, because we typically do have blind spots. And then I'd really pass the ball over to Kushbu for the AI ML piece, because she's really doing some really incredible stuff with respect to, because you've got the tools, you now have the indications, you have the threat piece. Now, how do you automate that through from a platform perspective to be really agile? And this is definitely her thunder here, so she'll talk to it a whole lot better than I. But that's kind of how I look, how we've gone through the maturation. But really now we're at the cusp of tying these things together, so it truly is continuous monitoring. Now it's finalizing some of those people that have kind of been stuck in the mud, frankly, on the compliance front into this new world order, so they're much more agile. But Kushbu, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Bill. I mean, going back to it is, I mean, AI ML is the future, along with everything else that we've been working on, right? So how do we utilize the chatbot RPA functionalities that can actually bring everything together? I mean, we need to move away from doing our manual processes. We need to be able to tick and tie all the different aspects together, whether it's the security operations piece, whether it's quote unquote the compliance piece. But you want to be able to see in one not to use Pete's words, but like a single pane of glass. How do I see my overall cybersecurity risks using all the technologies that are available, also ensuring that, we're not moving away from RMF anytime soon. We still have to make sure that, our quote unquote ANA packages or ATO packages, but how do I make it a more efficient process, a more secure process, and also be able to truly give that view that, okay, it's not just about, compliant controls, non-compliant controls, but am I really looking at it from the lens which are the biggest threats in my environment, or which are the biggest vulnerabilities in my environment? So that's where the AI ML comes in. But using the platform capabilities, we've been able to actually use, for lack of a better term, intelligent automation to actually make the process better. I will sit here and tell you, if someone tells me I can get you an ATO in a day, yeah, that's possible. But that's only if you have the right people in place who are in agreement with what you're introducing into your environment and what is your risk that you're willing to accept. But that doesn't happen, just like that or just overnight. With the new technology that we're talking through here, with the AI, ML, tying all of these processes together from a platform perspective, I think that's truly possible, because now if I go in and I want to see what is truly my risk, I'll be able to see it in one snapshot. I can drill down further and see, okay, it's not a documentation that's really affecting my environment. I don't have X, Y, and Z mechanisms in place. And then how do I fix that? How do I account for it? So, and just going back to it is using AI, ML, and then working with all the platforms together. I think that's truly the way for the future.
Well, I couldn't agree more, and thank you for that, Kushbu, because AI and ML are really critical when you talk about responding at machine speed and understanding the priority of what you're defending. I'd like to remind all of our audience that if you have any questions for our panelists, please enter them in the Q&A on the button on the right-hand side of your screen, so that we can get those questions to our panelists while we're live. But Pete, I'd like to go with you and kind of round things up with, from your perspective, where you're sitting today, how can the vendor community help you achieve the risk reduction that you're trying to achieve within the Department of State?
I think there is an answer to that. I think the answer is easier than the practice. If we're in a business of for-profit activities, every tool or every capability that is at somebody's disposal is the end-all, be-all, or will solve all the problems, right? And the people that are describing this are not being misleading. They're trying to say that they believe they have a nuanced way or an innovative way of solving a problem that has maximum application. No arguments with that at all. The challenge is that I don't know that I've run across anybody yet, with the possible exception of banking. And I say possible because I think there's even constraints there. But nobody has as many people as they'd like to have fighting this problem, and nobody has as much money as they'd like to have to solve this problem. And therefore, the same thing that has plagued technology throughout most of its existence is we have to be resource aware and put our resources where they do us the best good. And sometimes it's difficult to tell through the vendor community where that may be. So the challenges are simple, right? I think you've heard from both Kushbu and Bill that we're getting to the point where we're narrowing in on the things that matter. Right. I used to use an automotive analogy that you don't want to drive a car that's missing lug nuts, but you're okay driving it if the dome light doesn't come on when you open the door. Right. So let's worry about the things that are important. And helping our business colleagues understand what that is a big element of it. So checkbox number one, any capability that provides us a means to bridge that technological business gap to help business understand better what as technologists are seeing is helpful. The ask number two would be, in those areas where we have this plethora of tool sets out there, software, hardware capabilities, whatever it may be, those that focus on what I call the a priori controls, those controls that if absent will guarantee you an exploitation if attempted, are going to be the most important. Those things you have to get 2 things lined up to make it happen, or 3 things lined up to make it happen. You buy yourself a little time, right? It's just like we used to say in the old days, that what's inside the wire and how far inside the wire it is. So we need the vendors to help us understand, is their tool pointed at the first line of defense, the second line of defense, the third line of defense, or in what way will it help us with that primary concern? As we move into trying to focus on just those things first to get a stabilized environment so we can focus on the back-end programs, that would be very helpful. I don't think I could go further in giving guidance out because the industry is very widespread. Obviously, it's a very large field of programs that people operate and offer. I've seen a lot of great tools. I've seen some come and go. Some of that's through, M&As where larger organizations buy up the capability and expand their own, tool set, and that's fine. And then I've seen things that are invested in that very quickly don't pan out, not because they weren't good ideas, but because technology pivots so frequently. And it's difficult to say that something you had 10 years ago as the end all be all is still going to be the end all be all. So, I think to borrow a page out of Bill's book, the agility is really important. To borrow a page out of Kush's book, I think the more we can let technology run technology or get machine speed automation, whether it's AI or ML, is really important. But all of that becomes best when it's focused on the priority of the problem.
I couldn't agree more, and thank you for that, Pete. Bill, we don't have any questions from our audience yet, so I'm going to pose a question to each of you. And I'll start with you, Bill. If there was one thing that you could recommend to our audience today that they could implement within their agencies that would increase their resiliency and help them have a stronger risk profile, what would it be?
Well, I kind of go back to my speed, so I won't belabor that one. Speed matters, and if you as a CISO or a senior cyber person aren't driving speed and agility, I think you're failing. So I kind of talked about that one. So if I could, I'll jump on Pete's piece, but I think it'll tie into the other big thing is in the industry base, we talk about SIEM SOAR, the integration and orchestration components. I think if there was one area, because if you think about AI ML, right, it's only as good as the data, it's only as good as the integration and the ecosystem that drives and feeds that AI ML layer. So if you could solve one thing, I would say focus on the integration orchestration processes. So to Kushbu's point, the censoring and all those kind of elements tied in through a data fabric into your SIEM SOAR engine, if you will, to drive AI ML behaviors. I would love to see industry continue to partner and grow that ecosystem together, where there's much better and tighter APIs and much better collaboration and data sharing. Because frankly, this is a whole of nation issue. To some degree, we need to take off a little bit of the capitalism that we all drive as a part of industry, at least a little bit, so that we start to see the bigger good with, frankly, whether you're a criminal or a nation state actor, that's what's going to have us survive as a nation. And so bringing those integration layers together across all of these different tools and platforms, y'all have all been to RSA, right? I mean, it's a plethora of tools. One of the entrance criteria ought to be, how well do you integrate with other platforms to drive that next generation of AI ML?
That's great, Bill, and I appreciate that. Kushbu, what do you see? What's the one thing that you could recommend to our audience that they could implement in their agency right now?
I mean, one thing I will honestly say is we need to make sure that each of our program teams at the system owner or your day-to-day people who are implementing, or not just even implementing, but they're sustaining your environment, are clearly aware of what the threat vectors are. right? We all have different teams. We all need to understand truly what the cybersecurity risks are. When I am building a system, or when I'm working with my admins, they'll say, okay, yeah, you have your ATO requirements you have to meet, you have security you have to worry about. Oh, I'm required to build the system really, really fast. So I'll worry about security later. So we have to help modernize that mindset, right? And that starts with us working together. And sorry, Bill, to use your word, but that agility is important. Making sure that we are collaborating with each of our partners is important, whether it's a brand new system, an existing system, whatever have you, or even just from an enterprise-wide level. How do we make that happen? And that's the key, is collaboration. Collaboration, making sure you understand your overall risk to that environment.
Thank you so much for that, Kushbu. Pete, you're in the seat right now. You've got the responsibilities. What do you tell your fellow practitioners in government? What should they focus on right now to help increase their risk posture in their agencies?
Yeah, I think this is heavily a cultural issue. You've heard me speak to communications and the divide between technologists and business. I kid with the folks in my office that I'm going to print out a large banner and hang it up on the wall, and it's going to say simply this: just because you can doesn't mean you should. And so I would ask that my business colleagues, as they're looking at ways to improve their own capabilities and meet mission goals and business thresholds that they're trying to achieve, that they think about the fact that there's more than one way to do this, and there always has been. And are there differences in the ways you do that might put you in a better risk position for success? We do it in almost every other area. When we're investing money for return, we clearly evaluate different ways in which we could do that and get the greatest return and what risk comes with it. When we talk about personnel security, we look at the operating environment, where we are, where we're putting people, how well positioned they are against people or non-people related threats like hurricanes, et cetera, that could cause them harm. We don't do it in cyber because it's not something we can see or something we can touch or something we can smell, right? It defies our senses. It's all up in the ether. And that makes it very difficult for a lot of people that are very pragmatic and stay realistic and in the real world to get a concept of, wow, that just happened, right? There's been tries at some commercials. You probably know the one where an office full of cubicles and one person clicks on something and up comes this laughing beast saying, ha, 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 you've been had, and it starts to propagate, right? Nobody wants to be that person, right? But at the same time, we have to lean into risk in order to accomplish great things. And so the idea here is think before you act, right? Just because you can doesn't mean you should, but you might still anyway. That's the correlation to that. And I would ask people to just keep that in mind regardless of where you are, because just like in the kinetic world where we had the see something, say something campaign, we need a similar sort of mantra within the cyber world. And maybe it's not, just because you can doesn't mean you should. Maybe it's something simpler than that. But we do need that so that we can leverage everybody. There will never be enough cyber professionals. So if we can leverage our user base to say, maybe I won't do that today, or maybe I'm okay risking my personal access to that, but not my corporate access to that. And if we get there, I think we can close a lot of these avenues of opportunity, and then bridging that with the ML AI driven monitoring and detection capabilities and pivotal functions in technology. I think we'll be better off. So just because you can doesn't mean you should, is where I come at it from.
Pete, that's funny when you say that, because it's like echoing what my wife says to me all the time. Just because you can doesn't mean you should do that. But I'd be remiss if I didn't bring one final topic to all three of you. And Bill, I know this is a hot spot for you, and that's people. Regardless of the technology that we bring to bear, regardless of how much we look at the processes, it's the people that execute those processes and utilize that technology. What can we take from today's cyber workforce, and what are some of the requirements of the cyber workforce of the future? And where do you see the people aspect of this playing as we go forward? Is it going to be totally machine dominated in the future, or is there still a viable part for human interaction as part of cyber warfare? Bill?
Oh, I definitely have a belief that, AI will only help us. There's some that are kind of the world is going to end, robots are going to take over. I think there's certainly a human dimension. With war, there's always human dimension. It will never be that clean, but the piece on the workforce side of it, right, is it's got a couple pieces. One is we still have a pretty significant deficit as the United States in that realm. And so I like to challenge people in these forums of, are you going out and helping fertilize that elementary school, that junior high, that high school, that college young child or student or teenager to really come to this business? Because frankly, everything we do has got cyber baked into it. So it's absolutely critical that we put that hat on. From a current workforce perspective, I've been very key on, I think every cybersecurity leader ought to be baking in the training and education to every single proposal that you put out there, right? You ought to be asking and demanding industry to come in and not just give me the technology and the processes, but also come in and upskill my workforce. Because again, this market is moving so fast and the tools are moving so fast. So I really want to stress that one of like, ask for it, demand it, put it part of your initiative, because we all know, frankly, a lot of these techs are moving so fast, we just can't keep up. And then last but not least is go outside your normal domain, right? Everyone's going to be touched by cyber, right? At Accenture, as an example, everyone goes through all the core training, which a lot of companies do, but we don't go that extra step oftentimes to these advanced tactics, some of the intelligence behind it, some of the threat actors. So bringing that additional dimension in for the extended workforce, especially in non-tech companies, I think is instrumental, right? If you're a logistician, you're just as important in the security chain as the actual security profession, if not even more important. So I would just leave those three dimensions with the audience here, and hopefully those resonate.
That's really good. And, we do our cybersecurity training here at ServiceNow as well. And I'm always guilty of being the guy who gets caught on the phishing attack. I don't know. I guess I'm more able to be social engineered. I don't know. Kushbu, what do you think?
So I'll bring a little bit of a different aspect here. Cyber workforce, we are thinking about cyber workforce, not just now, but also for the future. So I've actually, through this lovely COVID situation, I've had to live through with 2 young kids having to use laptops, which, my 5-year-old knows how to use Google Meet, or my 7-year-old knows how to open a Google chat room, right? So I think the mindset of me teaching as a parent, teaching the cyber awareness as part of what my kids are doing, but not just the kids, but even the school situation, how do we handle that? That's important. But how it's relevant from a cyber workforce perspective is, again, cyber should be ingrained in every individual, because at the end of the day, we need to work together, right? As Bill mentioned, right? We need to upskill folks. And even with AI and ML, I still think there is still going to be human in the loop. But I think what we're going to now focus on is what is mission essential? What do we need to actually accomplish? And I think that's where the cyber workforce will be changing, where, we are focused on truly preventing those threat vectors, recognizing them, and how do we actually make our organization more secure? So my thought process is we're starting now, and we're also training the next generation of the cyber workforce. So let's help our existing generation and help them focus on the key mission aspects, but then also let's train our generation for the future. Thank you.
That's excellent. And Kushbu, thank you so much for joining me today. Bill, Pete, this has been a really enlightening panel. I couldn't thank you any more than I am. I'm just thrilled to be a part of this. To our audience, thank you so much for joining us here today, and we hope that you enjoyed this particular program. Thank you.